Good morning. My name is Fadhel Kaboub. I'm an associate professor of economics at Denison University in Ohio and president of the Global Institute for Sustainable Prosperity. Thank you so much for being here. Thank you for the kind invitation and for participating in this important South-North dialogue. Unfortunately, I couldn't be with you in person due to prior commitments. So I'm sending you this recorded video from Abidjan. I'll start with a simple message that it's important for us to think in transformative ways, to think about radical transformative solutions. Radical as in going to the roots of the problems, and transformative as in making sure that we avoid the structural traps that the Global South in particular has been locked into for so long. And here I'm reminded of the words of Martin Luther King Jr. in the context of the civil rights movement, when he said, "I have no time for the tranquilizing drugs of gradualism and incrementalism." And similarly, our situation today, the pulley crisis that we're dealing with, requires that kind of thinking and that kind of intervention. And that leads me to the following report, which I'd like to flag for you. If you go to justtransitionafrica.org, you'll find this recent report that I had the pleasure to contribute to, published about a month ago. And the subtitle says, sets the context there, which is a climate, energy, and development vision for Africa. And it's written from a Pan-African perspective, but you'll see clearly that some of the structural traps that we described there from an African perspective are also present in the broader Global South. So what are the structural deficiencies, economic deficiencies that we deal with in the Global South, that we deal with in Africa, that we must recognize and must avoid? We have an external debt crisis. And here, external debt, I mean debt denominated in foreign currencies, in dollars and euros and British pounds and so on. We're not talking about national debts denominated in national currencies. And the major root causes, when you start digging for most countries in the Global South, in Africa in particular, are three root causes. First is energy deficits. And here I actually include countries like Nigeria, that are presumably massive producers of fossil fuels, for example, but a country like Nigeria imports 100% of its gasoline. So we end up in this structural trap where you, even as a major fossil fuel producer, you still have an energy deficit because of technological dependencies and so on. Food deficits. Africa today imports 85% of its food. And this is typical for most countries in the Global South, and I'll show you some of the data in a minute, not by accident, because we know that during the colonial times, Africa in particular used to be the breadbasket for European colonizers. And after independence in the 50s and the 60s, we see major producers in the Global North introducing massive subsidies to their agricultural industry in the form of the Common Agricultural Policy, for example, in the US, in the European Union, which exists to this day, which created a situation whereby Global South farmers were pushed into dropping the production of core crops, such as wheat, rice, barley, and so on, and moving into producing cash crops, often with foreign seeds that require more water, that require more fertilizers and pesticides. So cash crops became the main agricultural items produced in Africa. And that created a situation where we depend on the imports of basic necessities, basic food items. And then finally, the third structural trap is the type of industrialization that we ended up pursuing in the Global South, which focuses primarily on low value added industrial options and extractive industries with essentially no value added to the output. And here, this is again a technological deficiency, a technological trap that doesn't allow you to climb up the value chain over time. So you take these three structural problems, put them together, you have a structural trade deficit, which weakens the value of your currency, which means everything you import the next morning with a weaker currency, whether it's food or fuel, you're importing it at a higher price. So you're literally importing inflation. And inflation, when it comes to basic food items and fuel and medicine, could lead to social unrest unless there's food subsidies, fuel subsidies introduced by the government, which forces a country to continue to borrow in foreign currencies, which ends up being a band-aid solution. And you do this year after year after year until you build up towards a currency crisis, an external debt crisis. And that's essentially the vicious cycle that most of our countries struggle with. So any transformative solutions that we introduce can't be called transformative unless it addresses these root causes and gets us out of this structural trap. Now, let's take this at the global scale, and I'll explain this graph in a second. If you divide the world in two groups, global north and global south, rich countries versus poor countries, or whichever terminology you want to use, and then you net out all the global financial transactions, what you see is this green line, which the latest data here shows us we have a negative $2 trillion, $2 trillion moving from the global south to the global north. And this is net, meaning it includes exports, imports, interest payments, charity, foreign direct investment, remittances, everything is included here. The net amount is a neocolonial global extraction from the global south. And that is unsustainable politically, economically, ecologically, morally. We can't continue in this direction. And notice the acceleration of this number, meaning if we don't do anything about the international financial architecture, the global economic architecture, this number will become $10 trillion in a few years, $15 trillion later. This is the momentum of the existing system, and it must be stopped. It must be reversed. And if you put this in a larger context in terms of what we've been trying to do, for example, to address climate change, to bring in climate finance, you have on the one hand the $2 trillion moving in the wrong direction, and then on the other hand you have empty promises for $100 billion a year to address climate change, empty promises for a green climate fund that only last time I checked, has about $11 billion in it. And yet again, another empty bucket in the global climate finance architecture of $0 billion so far from the COP27 Loss and Damage Fund. So this is not even a drop in the bucket if we're not addressing the structural deficiencies that we have on a global scale. All of these climate efforts essentially amount to nothing in the bigger scheme of things. So zooming in on Africa as a whole, as a unit, if you look at the total volume of Africa's exports, about $585 billion, and I picked 2019 here on purpose so that we have pre-COVID numbers. If you just eyeball the composition of exports, you see a lot of raw materials. And then if I switch the image to Africa's imports, notice that the composition changes. You have much more complex products imported with much more value-added content imported. And notice the volume of imports. Notice the structural trade deficit that Africa as a whole has. We have a volume of $737 billion. And this is true not just for the continent as a whole, this is true for every single country in the continent. I'm picking here Côte d'Ivoire as a random example, simply because I'm here in Abidjan today. And notice the volume of exports, notice the composition of Côte d'Ivoire's exports, essentially raw materials, and notice the composition of Côte d'Ivoire's imports, much more value-added content, and the volume also puts the country in a structural trade deficit, which accelerates the external debt problem over time. So structural solutions, we have to have Pan-African Global South cooperation for strategic investments in food sovereignty, not just food security, We have to have cooperation and strategic investments in renewable energy sovereignty. And here on this continent in particular, and the global south in general, we have all the critical minerals needed for an industrial revolution that is based on renewable energy sovereignty and food sovereignty, and based on high value added industrial policies. So these are the three components of structural solutions that have to be part of the conversation in any South-South dialogue, in any South-North dialogue, if we're serious about transformation. And of course, putting it in a global context, we have to address the global financial architecture in the international trade system that perpetuates the suction of those $2 trillion from the global south to the global north. So these types of transformative intervention are unavoidable, to be honest, if we're serious about these issues. And finally, to put this in a broader sense, what we're talking about is really giving the global south as individual countries, as blocks of countries, the capacity to increase over time the degree of monetary sovereignty. And here, monetary sovereignty, you can think of it as a spectrum, with countries with high degree of monetary sovereignty like the US, like Japan, like Australia and Canada, and so on. And most of the global south is either on the other end of the spectrum with a limited degree of monetary sovereignty or no monetary sovereignty whatsoever. I'm here in a country that's part of the CFA franc zone, which has no monetary sovereignty. It still uses a colonial currency, essentially. And what the degree of monetary sovereignty allows you as a country is that it gives you this additional fiscal policy space that allows the government to spend strategically without causing inflation, without accelerating an external debt problem. So most countries with a limited degree of monetary sovereignty have high levels of external debt that puts them in a situation where they're almost forced to pursue a fixed exchange rate policy in order to stabilize the currency artificially at a high level in order to avoid the trap of having to import inflation and so on. And that perpetuates the cycle of external debt. So to summarize here, we have the global south with low degree of monetary sovereignty. The global south is not responsible for climate change. The global south with high external debt, low productive capacity, low capacity for research and development, and suffers from this neo-colonial extractive economic system. On the other hand, you have the global north with high degree of monetary sovereignty, is responsible for climate change. Let's call it climate debt, to be honest. Has low to no external debt to speak of, has high productive capacity, high research and development capacity, and actually benefits from the existing neo-colonial extractive system. So how do we repair this problem? We repair it with actual reparations, climate reparations, colonial and neo-colonial debt reparations. And by reparations, we mean several things. First, acknowledging this problem, acknowledging the pain, acknowledging the damage that's been done. Number two, starting the reparations by repairing the global financial architecture that perpetuates this, repairing the international trade architecture that perpetuates this. And number three, canceling debts, as in canceling climate debt, canceling colonial and neo-colonial debt, and then actual reparations in the form of transfer of technology, that is in-kind reparations, and transfer of financial resources to help accelerate the transition to a sustainable, just, and equitable global system that's balanced, that's resilient, and that's sustainable. So I use the term reparations in this sense. To conclude, we're running out of time when it comes to the public crisis that we're dealing with, especially on the climate front. The climate crisis, the inequality, poverty, exclusion, injustice, all of these call for urgent, bold, and radical transformation. The current climate policies, jobs policies are too weak, too slow, expensive, ineffective, and actually dangerous. So a realistic plan for a just transition requires a fundamental restructuring of the global economic architecture, and I'm certain that this is the centerpiece of the conversation today in this conference. And as a result, I believe that a global Green New Deal with climate reparations is possible, desirable, and affordable. Thank you very much, and I hope to see you soon.